I am delighted to see this many people this interested in the future of genetic medicine. My name is Amy Webb, and I'm the Chief Executive Officer of the Future Today Strategy Group. My company does long-range scenario planning and then strategy. And part of what makes a really good futurist, somebody who's really, really good at the work that I do, is the ability to do something called reperception, which is to take what we can see in the present but then see alternative, different futures. Reperception is very important for innovation, it's very important for strategy, and you people are very lucky today because I have somebody here who excels at the art of reperception. So Andrew Adams is at the forefront of a very exciting and very, very important revolution in medicine. One where diseases that we once thought were totally untouchable are going to be treated at their very source, our genes. As Group Vice President of Molecule Discovery and the Director of the Lilly Institute for Genetic Medicine, he leads the charge in developing cutting-edge therapies across small molecules, antibodies, and most excitingly, genetic medicine. His work spans the most critical areas in healthcare today, regardless of where you are in the world. Pain, neurodegeneration, which you're going to hear a lot about, and genetic-based treatments, where the science is evolving at an incredible pace. Under his leadership, Lilly's genetic medicine portfolio is expanding rapidly, tackling RNA-based therapies, gene editing, and gene therapy in ways that will fundamentally change our approach to medicine and disease. Andrew's path to this work started with a biology degree. I'm not going to spoil it for you, but this was not where he wound up is definitely not where he started, and it's an awesome story. He was at the University of Aberdeen in Scotland, followed by a postdoc at Harvard Medical School. He's been at Lilly since 2011, and he's worn many different hats, leading early discovery teams, driving external innovation, and honestly playing a fundamental role in shaping the future of medicine. So he is going to give you a rare glimpse into that future, a future which is going to make the world better for everyone. So please, please, please put your hands together and give a warm welcome to Dr. Andrew Adams.
All right. Wow, that's one of the nicest introductions I've had so far, so I really appreciate it. Amy, thanks for making the time today to be with us. I'm really excited to give this talk. It's something that's very personal to me, and I'm happy that I've got the opportunity today to share it with you. I've been working in genetic medicine now for over 10 years at Eli Lilly and Company, but I've been thinking about the potential a lot longer than that. We've pursued at the company targets that historically have been considered undruggable, and our goal is to use genetic medicine to treat and then hopefully cure underlying genetic diseases. But that goal feels sort of not enough these days. I was at a dinner a couple weeks ago with our CEO, and we were discussing sort of the long-term goals for the company, and he'd asked me, okay, well, what's next? Like, we were talking about some of the stuff I'll show you today, some of the great medicines that we've developed. And I said that the goal actually next should be to eliminate all chronic disease. Like, that should be the goal for the company. And so to do that, you have to go before the disease starts. And so that's what I'm going to talk to you about today, is using genetic medicine to stop diseases in their tracks. But I'll start probably with more of a personal story here. In the early 2000s, this is my grandmother, this is Nana Vicky. She was diagnosed with dementia. At the time, all I really wanted to do was to help her. A decade's passed, and as scientists, we know a lot more about the causes of dementia. And I know three things, actually. One was that I was too late and too slow. Two, I'm at risk of developing dementia as well. And three, that because of this personal experience, I know that for other people in situations similar to mine, that we need to aim higher. We need to do better. So this is my genetic information. I'm not going to walk you through what the specific details mean here, but other than red is usually bad, and in this case, red is still bad. I have a copy of the ApoE4 allele, which means that I'm at a statistically higher risk of developing Alzheimer's disease, which is bad, but it's motivation for sure. You know, I want to work so that I don't have to experience what I saw my grandmother experience. But I have even more pressing near-term motivation. This is my mom's risk for Alzheimer's disease, and her risk is double mine because she has 2 ApoE4 alleles. It's basically, if you get into your 70s, close as we have genetically to a guarantee that you're at high risk of disease. And she's 67, so 3 years. We're working really hard to translate these ideas to medicines as quickly as possible because people like my mom are waiting on the work that we're doing. But you know, in future, obviously it would be great if instead of trying to treat these diseases, which is the way that Alzheimer's disease works today, that we could intervene earlier with things like genetic medicines, where in a convenient package, we can give you a medicine that you maybe take once in your life, and it reduces your risk to that of the average population. In this case, could we edit this risky gene that I carry, that my mom carries, back to the wild-type version that most of you in the audience carry? We technically have the technology today to do it. We could change those risky genes back to normal, but we need to continue to put all those pieces together and move from an idea of waiting until something goes wrong, so waiting until people develop cognitive symptoms, to instead testing early and then treating early so that people don't ever have to develop cognitive symptoms. And actually, the progress is pretty dramatic right now in the field that we work in. Since the 1970s, actually, genetic medicine's been on a rapid upswing in terms of utility and the types of diseases that people have been going after. Essentially, functional cures for things like hemophilia A, hemophilia B, sickle cell, where you interact with the patient once in their life, you give them an infusion or an injection, and they no longer are hopefully at the risk of developing that disease. For some of these treatments, we're at 10, 11 years out from the injection. Patients still seem stable. We feel optimistic that this might be one of the steps on the path to one and done. But maybe for me, like the most personally exciting thing that I've been able to work on in the last few years at Lilly is, you may have seen there was a New York Times story last year where we disclosed some of the data around a treatment that we have for a genetic form of hearing loss. In this case, what happens is you have machinery in your inner ear that's required for you to process sound coming in, to turn it into electrical signals in your brain that then you recognize as language. In the otoferlin patients' cases, they lack some of that machinery in the inner ear, and so the signals don't get accurately translated from sound into words in your head. And so these children, this child I'm about to show you, has been deaf for 8 years. Not hearing impaired, functionally profoundly deaf. We gave 1 injection into 1 ear of the gene therapy to put back in a functional version of this protein that the child is missing. And then you wait about 30 days, and then magic happens.
眼睛、
眼睛、
鼻子、
鼻子、
耳朵、
耳朵、
嘴巴、
嘴巴、
大象、
大象、
小白兔、
小白兔、
猴子、
猴子、
牛、
牛、
书包、
书包、
月亮、
月亮、
大象、
大象、
葡萄。
葡萄、
你叫什么名字？
和
你几岁了？
8岁，
青蛙会飞吗？
不会。
你什么时候睡觉？
9点，
小白兔喜欢吃什么？
红萝卜。
I think I've seen that video like 100 times. It never gets old, though. And the team, every patient that we treat, I get a text, like a month after now, and I look forward to the text because I know when the kids have been treated, and I know when I'm going to get the text saying, patient X can now hear normally, and I really enjoyed that part of my job. So what this looks like in terms of the patients, right? These are kids often who've been deaf since birth. The oldest that we've treated so far is an 11-year-old, this patient, who went from a baseline of being profoundly deaf, so 0 experience of hearing for 11 years, and then we treated with the gene therapy to put otoferlin back in again. Now this child has better hearing than most of us in the room, essentially functionally normal. I'm used to at work thinking about iterative medicines, of making small steps forward in terms of helping patients. This isn't iterative, this is transformative medicine. This is the goal, I think, that we need to have at Lilly in future, using genetic medicine, not just for diseases like otoferlin loss for hearing loss, but also for bigger diseases. Why not for Alzheimer's, for Parkinson's disease, for cardiovascular disease, diseases that affect millions of people? So that's the journey we're on of translating those ideas. But one of the biggest roadblocks that exist today is that, of all the patients who have hearing loss, so you all know, the parents in the room, if you have a child in the US, they get newborn hearing screens, and then if they fail that newborn hearing screen, the theory is that they go on to get genetic testing to figure out what's going on. That doesn't really happen, actually, most of the time. So if I had you guess, you probably would say at least like 50% of the time, right? That you get a test if you fail. It's 20% of kids that fail the newborn hearing screen get a genetic test. Part of that is because historically, the only option was cochlear implant, and you basically went ahead with that regardless because there were no treatments for the genetic forms. Now, with treatments like ours and those other people are pursuing, we feel confident that the time is right to expand that testing. And so Lilly are really proud to operate the Resonate program at the company, where we offer to eligible participants who have been diagnosed with bilateral sensorineural hearing loss free access to genetic testing here in the US, so that they can have the information they need to seek whatever treatment's appropriate for them or for their child. And we'll be talking about more details there in the coming months, but the goal for us is to sort of reduce that barrier so that people can take control of their individual health and make whatever decision they feel is right for them. Because what we're doing with otoferlin, we're not saying everybody has to do this, right? What we're saying is, here's another option. If your child happens to meet these criteria, this is potentially the size of effect that it can have. The interesting thing that, it's not in my notes, but I always like saying it, in the textbooks for hearing loss, it says that you get until about age 5 for normal development of language, because something brain plasticity, and if you wait too long, then people can't learn speech. 11-year-old understands speech, so we have to rewrite the textbook a little bit about how the brain works and about how plastic those systems are. Okay, but we're still at the beginning of the story, right? And I feel like with things like otoferlin, now we're at a tipping point. And I think that tipping point can mean big changes in big diseases. So we need to be bold, and we need to be visionary at companies like Lilly, and we've taken that mandate to heart. 7 years ago, when I started working on the portfolio at the company as it relates to genetic medicine, we had 0% genetic medicine at the company. Today, it represents around 38% of all the medicines that we make, so a third of the things that we do are these kinds of treatments. And we're excited to see, maybe for people like my grandmother and my mom and myself, that this can be part of how we eliminate dementia. Okay, but like Amy mentioned a little bit at the start, like a moderate segue that hopefully you'll indulge me in for a couple minutes. My goal was to be a paleontologist, actually. My PhD is not in chemistry or biology. I wake up every day very grateful that Lilly are willing to ignore that and let me lead the group of people that I do. But my PhD was in zoology, and I was interested for a long time in being a paleontologist, still am. And probably when I hang up my lab coat at Lilly, I'll be off with the fossil hammer down in a ravine somewhere. So still a dinosaur fan. This is me and my nephew, Oliver, a couple years ago. So I'm going to use it as an analogy, because otherwise I never get to put a dinosaur slide in my talks that I give anywhere. So, you guys get it. And I think it actually is a really good analogy for sort of the periods that we've been in genetic medicine. So obviously, right now I would say we're sort of in that Triassic period, unfortunately, on the early side of things, right? We're focused on treating diseases, things like otoferlin, where we find a child who has hearing loss, we do a genetic test, we figure out what the eligibility, if the medicine might work, and then we treat them. And I think that's great, and we should keep doing things like that. People who are struggling with things like ALS now have genetic medicines that take that same approach of trying to fix the thing that's broken. But I think the Jurassic period is going to be about intervening earlier. So you may be aware, but we're working in gene editing in cardiovascular disease. So taking some risk factors that people have through their lives for having cardiovascular events, heart attacks and strokes, and giving them a one-time treatment with our partners at Webb Therapeutics that completely reduces that risk, we hope, for an entire lifetime. We'll see. We're still in clinical trials right now. But you can take that concept from Triassic treatment to Jurassic prevention. So really there, you're sort of finding people with risk factors and you're trying to mitigate those risk factors. The Cretaceous period is going to be an interesting one because right now we're focused on sickness with these tools that we have. But you could argue that once we've started to chip away at sickness, you can get into how can you improve health span in patients. So how can we take advances in genetic medicines and radically change how we age? At Lilly, we've been chipping away at diseases, like I said. You're probably aware of the work that we do in obesity and diabetes. It's fairly popular right now. But Alzheimer's and oncology are other big areas for us that we've been invested in for a long time. And as you chip away at these things, you can see from the graph, basically you raise up the health span of people by eliminating chronic diseases. But once you've eliminated most of those chronic diseases, you get to the fundamental biology of aging, and can we help people live longer, healthier lives with very short periods of mortality and morbidity at the end, versus what we have today, which many of you know from your experiences with your family. You get to 60 to 70, and then it's a gradual decline over the course of decades, which is obviously not optimal. And we have a lot of tailwinds. The funding is growing, actually, for figuring out this biology, and we have bigger ambitions in genetic medicine at the company. So for us, we're pushing aggressively here. I think we're one of the early adopters of focusing on health span, but it's a logical extension of the things that we already worked on at the company. And we have, like I said, tailwinds, 4 of which, I'll point out. I love showing this slide because it's the building that we built for genetic medicine in Boston. This is in the Seaport. There's around 700 scientists there who work on these kinds of therapies, on these kinds of ideas. And I like it because every time I walk up to that building, I remember 10 years ago, there was no building, there was no excitement about genetic medicine at the company. And so when I see the building, it's like a physical representation of the hard work that the team has done to make this exist. And the work that's being done in that building is not just on things like hearing loss. We're working on things like ALS, Parkinson's disease, Alzheimer's disease, really terrible neurodegenerative diseases that impact many of us right now that we think genetic medicine may be useful in treating. And I think the other thing that this kind of an effort underscores is we need to work towards widespread genetic testing to empower people to understand their own genome. So you know what you're at risk for and you can seek out treatment proactively. And then we need early intervention. We know we can have the biggest effect sizes in the medicines that we make at the company when we intervene early. In our obesity medicines, if you give them to patients with risk of developing type 2 diabetes, we ran a study. It was long, it was expensive, but what we showed was that 94 or 96%, it's in the high 90s, of patients who are treated with this medicine before they develop type 2 diabetes don't go on to develop the disease, which is obviously a massive reduction and potentially a huge boon for the healthcare system if you can prevent people from moving to type 2 diabetes, which, along with all of its sequelae, things like kidney disease, heart disease, are expensive and protracted things that people have to deal with. So technology also is moving quickly. The great thing about the work that we do in genetic medicine is it's based on code. So you can extrapolate a lot of the ideas from AI and ML that are very trendy right now to our code-based problem and make fairly significant advances relatively quickly. So we're viewing medical challenges through the lens of technology, and that's giving us an entirely new perspective on diseases and on new approaches we can take. For example, in RNA editing, some of the work that we're doing at the company similar to gene editing, we're using this sequence data along with machine learning to figure out the best places in the genome to intervene to give people novel medicines for things like ALS. The community in genetic medicine is also incredibly collaborative. It's great when you get to be part of the early phase of a period of scientific innovation like this, in that everyone's working together, papers come out all the time, it's really energizing. And so we work at Lilly with biotechs, we work with academics, and we have collaborations for the past sort of 10 years with people like Genetic Leap, Dicerna, Avidity, ProQR, Prevail, and Akuos, who I showed you the hearing loss work from. So really, really great time to be in the space, lots of investment, lots of excitement, and potentially lots of innovation for patients. And maybe the last thing that makes me feel really optimistic is some of the great people that I get to work with at the company. People like Mark Minton on the right and Dan Skowronski in the middle, who've dedicated their entire professional lives to eliminating Alzheimer's disease. And so from my perspective, just a great place to work. And Dan specifically was recognized last week with sort of the highest honor that the ADDF, the Alzheimer's Foundation, have to provide, with the Melvin Goods Prize. And so we're incredibly proud of him with what is the top honor in the field of Alzheimer's research. But Dan would tell you that we're just getting started. We're not done yet. So look forward to hearing more from us on Alzheimer's in the next few years, and hopefully telling you more about some of the things we're doing in genetic medicine for Alzheimer's. So coming back to this to close out, genetic medicine, I've shown you today with some of the hearing loss work and some of the other examples. We can do 0 to 1. We can create innovations that transform people's lives. And we can take the concept from sick care to health care. I don't know yet what it means for people like my grandmother and my mom and me. Like, there's still kinks in the technology we're working out. We're working hard every day at the company to make these medicines reality. But at Lilly and other places in the industry, we intend to grasp this opportunity and make these medicines a reality for patients. So I thank you for your attention today, and then I'd invite Amy to join me on the stage for the fireside chat. Thank you.
Okay. Andrew, I have a billion questions for you. Literally. All right, let's start with the first one. So I can't wrap my head around this idea that you're treating hearing loss with a medicine. So I get the flu, and I take amoxicillin. Do I? I know.
Maybe. Depends how bad your flu is.
Whatever. I get like a problem, and I take a medicine, and the white blood cells and the red blood cells and everything, and then I'm fine. Yeah. This feels, I don't get it. So I've got a child is born with hearing loss, and you're sticking them with an IV, and then 30 days later they're speaking fluent Chinese. So this. You need to explain. All of us, we don't understand this. So help us understand what you're talking about.
Yeah, it's a really good question. And so maybe a couple things on the medicine. So in this case with otoferlin, one of the things that's really great is, like I said, these kids are missing one thing. So like in the case of flu, if you were to get the flu, there's probably 50, 100,000 different things going on with your immune system to fight against that. And so it was and is a complicated problem to solve, the flu. That's why, every year we have to make new flu vaccines because it mutates so frequently. The great thing with otoferlin is these kids, we know, are precisely missing one protein. And we know that if you put that one thing back in again, in animal models and cell culture models, we can fix the broken circuit and then make it transmit sound again to their brains.
There's the protein in the bag.
Yeah.
They get injected and it's there forever?
No, it's different. It's a good question. So the other thing with this one is actually, this one is a really interesting project because the gene that we're putting in, so we're putting in the DNA that encodes the gene, is too big. We use viruses to deliver it, actually.
So that's a good point. Viruses, it turns out, not all bad. I know
No.
it's tough, right? This is like the 5th year anniversary in South by. This was the first big festival that got shut down.
Yeah.
Explain to people, for the non-scientists in here,
Yeah.
viruses are kind of like a USB stick, right? In a way?
100%, yeah.
Explain why.
We can take out all the contents that they usually have in them, and we can put our own cargo inside, and essentially now we're just using them as delivery vehicles.
So it's like nature's hard drive.
Yeah, it's like an Amazon truck, but for your inner ear.
Okay. All right. So viruses, not so bad all the time.
Yeah, I mean, in this case, we go after ones that don't typically cause disease in humans, obviously, and then we sort of hijack them as a delivery vehicle. We put the DNA inside them, and then they take that DNA to the right cells inside the inner ear. So to do that, the team invented a new surgical procedure. So the injection is actually directly into the inner ear.
Okay. It's an injection, but it's a genetic surgery, right?
Yeah, I mean, essentially what it is we're using the surgical technique to provide access for the virus to the cells that we need inside the inner ear, and then the virus does the last leg of getting that DNA inside of the cells. And then the great thing about DNA is the cells just read this as like, oh, I should be making this, and so they start making it.
It's just an instruction manual,
yeah, exactly.
right? Yeah.
And they start making it, and fortunately in this case, it seems to integrate normally into a functional hearing circuit, and then 30 days later, the kids can hear.
So that's pretty outstanding. That's pretty amazing.
It's so the one thing I will say about this is it's one of the top tier examples of this going really well. Mm-hmm. There are other places where people have tried gene therapies and it's been more difficult. Either we can't.
Like what?
So
We're all best friends. Tell us about your worst disasters.
No, I mean, so neurodegeneration is a great example, right? So Alzheimer's and Parkinson's. We would love to do, so there's a mutation called the Christchurch mutation that some of you may be aware of. Basically, it's in this gene that I'm at risk for. If you have this mutation, you're essentially completely protected from Alzheimer's disease. So we thought, like, oh, great, like, we can just put that into people who are at risk, and then we can prevent them from getting AD. The challenge is, the viruses are not very good at moving through the brain. So it's like, we can get it to very close to where you inject it, but when you need it to spread to the entirety of an adult's brain, it's not great. Like, it gets to about 9% of the brain, which for Alzheimer's, we need to get to deep brain structures responsible for memory. So the delivery problem is actually the biggest problem that we have of getting these medicines in the body to where we need them to go.
Mm-hmm. And we were talking earlier, so your grandmother had Alzheimer's.
Mm-hmm.
My father has Parkinson's, and it's just been it's been awful. He's a couple of different roads Parkinson's takes, and he's physically mostly okay, but has lost his ability to speak. And it's been tough. And so one of the things I was taking away as you were speaking is, it sounds to me like your team is moving away from this treatment orientation to let's fix it, to maybe like let's just not have it to start with. Is that a good representation of what you're doing?
Yeah, that's right. And I think, when you think about Parkinson's and Alzheimer's, they're good examples. So these are diseases where proteins don't fold right in your brain.
Can we just stop for a second? Everybody's talking about proteins these days.
Yeah.
I know AlphaFold's got their what's the deal with proteins? Help us understand.
So, for sure. The genetic material is the instruction kit. The proteins are basically the cookies that you make that do the work. So for us, we think about biology on a few different levels. So when you make pills, you're working at sort of the atomic level with structures of small molecules. I avoided chemistry like the plague in school because I was
Nobody
terrible
likes
at it.
chemistry.
Yeah.
Don't do that.
Sorry if anyone does in the audience.
We're not sorry at all.
So there's that level. And then there is the protein level. So it's like the building blocks, amino acids in your body make proteins, and the proteins are responsible for your skin and keratin in your nails. These are the bigger building blocks. And then, antibodies are part of your immune system. So what your body naturally uses to fight off infection. And we can make versions of those to target other things.
But the proteins are that important. If I can use a computer analogy, it's kind of like middleware.
Yeah.
Nothing works without the protein, right?
100%.
So, but that's kind of been a difficult, in your field, that's been the trick.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, proteins are challenging just because most of the ones that we found that are medicines, like some of the obesity and diabetes medicines today, they're just improved analogs of something that already exists in the body. Making new proteins is really hard, incredibly hard. Actually, making new biology of any flavor is incredibly hard.
So can we go back for a moment, because so you were watching this miracle patient.
Yep.
And you said that at this point, he went from zero hearing whatsoever,
Yep.
not just to hearing, but to hearing better than all of us in the room. So I got to ask you a question now.
Yeah.
And that is there a universe in which sometime in the future I might voluntarily take something, not just to repair, but maybe to enhance? And before everybody freaks out, I'm not talking about like that kind of enhancement. I was more thinking, my sister's an opera singer, and she would be, I just wonder if she had like a couple of clicks more hearing, if that would improve her. She's very talented, but would that improve her voice? It's more things like that.
Yeah, I think that, that is exactly how we're thinking about it at the company, right? Like the goal is, right now we're fixing things where there is something that's obviously broken, but all of us, every adult human, will experience age-related hearing loss. It's like a universal truth that as you age, when you get to around age 60, your hearing starts to decline, and then the older you get, the more rapidly it declines. So my thought with this was, and we have a program on regeneration, is what we call it internally, of like fixing that loss in patients as they age and giving them back normal hearing in their 60s and their 70s. So that is the goal. Rejuvenation is the goal.
Yeah, I feel like the term longevity has kind of gotten a bad rap. There's a lot of snake oils people, salesmen out there. What you're really talking about is, to me, very different. It's about getting older without getting old.
Yeah.
Right? And having, maybe not everybody's living to 150. Some people out there are certainly going to try, but the idea is not to have that. It sounds like not to have that, you like hit a cliff and then there's this decline.
Yeah, I think the goal is just that we don't want chronic disease to be it's an inevitability today, right? As we age, we'll develop some of these diseases. That's different than the fundamental biology of how aging works, which is sort of like this. You can look, there is like a relatively hard cap on human lifespan.
It's like 115
yeah,
years right
something
now.
like that. Yeah, exactly. And so my goal actually is today with Lily, let's just be really healthy until we hit that breakdown point, and then have a very short period of being ill.
That sounds good to me.
That's my goal.
So we've got neurodegenerative disease. We've
Yes.
got age-related diseases. What about stuff you can catch from other people? So like like an HIV or something else.
Yeah, so people are investigating. Hep B is probably the most advanced one in terms of genetic medicine right now, because we can make medicines called siRNAs. Essentially what they do is they go in and they find a matching piece of RNA.
Can I, that was a lot of letters. Yeah. What is that?
Yeah, so RNA is sort of the thing that comes before. It's the way that DNA writes messages to make proteins. Mm-hmm. And so
RNA is kind of like the instructions.
Exactly.
Right?
It sits in the middle of the two, of like the DNA that's the cookery book, and then the proteins that are what you're making. And so you can use synthetic things that we make to fish out bad instructions. So the instructions for making, replicating Hep B, we can fish those out, suppress them, and then when you combine that with antiviral drugs, you can actually give people, in some of these clinical trials, what looks like a functional cure for Hep B.
So like if we were to go X number of years into the future, let's not predict when, but let's just say at some point, like when I was pregnant, I went in for every genetic test somebody would give me. Mm-hmm. I'm wondering, so great, now I've got the information. I can't do anything with it, but at least I know. So is the future potentially, I go in for all of those diagnostics, and at the same time, maybe there is some genetic surgery or medicine that makes it so somebody would never get a disease to start with?
Yeah, that's the goal. A good example, my wife had preeclampsia twice when we had the kid.
I did not have that, but that is terrifying.
It was not great. So basically what happens is you go in one day for your usual OB/GYN visit, being pregnant, and then they admit you to the hospital because your blood pressure is super high and your organs are failing. Turns out there are some markers actually for that, and there are genetic medicine approaches you could take if someone, because the other thing I skipped over, if you have preeclampsia once, it's actually the biggest risk factor for having it twice. So you know after the first time that it's happened that you're at high risk of doing it. So in theory, before we had my second son, where she also had preeclampsia, we could have intervened before that with a genetic medicine to prevent some of these damaging proteins from increasing. So yes, you can, but you can do what you said and go even earlier than that, right? in theory, I got my whole genome sequence because I'm in charge of genetic
I
medicine.
also got my whole genome sequence because, I could.
Yeah, why not? Yeah. And it's super cheap these days, right? Like I remember when the Human Genome Project was like hundreds of millions of dollars to sequence one genome.
And took, 12 years?
Yeah.
Something like that? Yeah.
Yeah.
And now, have you seen the new portable sequencers? They're like $500.
Yeah.
You could bring one to your next cocktail party, sequence everybody, have a little chit chat. Probably
Yeah.
don't do that for HIPAA reasons and others.
But
Okay.
yeah, so like a couple $100, you can get your genome now.
So again, but here's what I'm trying to get at.
Yeah.
The information is great.
Yep.
So the issue previously had been we didn't have enough data ingestion. We didn't
Yes.
have enough data. So now these sequencers have gone from hundreds of bajillions of dollars and multiple years and arguments between scientists down to less and now you can buy one online. That gives us information. I guess what I'm asking you is what's the next inflection point where it's akin now to just going to a local drugstore and getting over-the-counter headache medicine. I mean, at what point do these breakthroughs that you're working on at Lilly become, commonplace?
Yeah. I think, and it's a good question, right? Like one of the things that I really like with things like sequencing is that people are feeling more empowered to take control of their own health, right? They're going out and finding out things. I even get a blood test every now and again because I'm curious about some of the things that I might have. But today, like with the Resonate program that we talked about, we still have to couple that with genetic counseling. So a specific person to explain to you what the results mean that you get. Because for the layperson today, I think it's still really complicated to figure out when you get that sequencing back. You get back an Excel file with 27,000 rows in it of all the different genes that you have. It's not particularly interpretable by someone without an advanced degree in biology. And so there are software that can help you dig through that. I think, think 23andMe for those of you that did it. It gives you the high-level risk things, but it doesn't give you sort of the detailed analysis you'll need. And so I think that what we need to do as a field is sort of find ways to simplify this for people, find ways to simplify it for physicians as well. And maybe there's a role for sort of technology and AI there, because that 27,000 row problem is a perfect AI problem.
So I agree with you. And I think sometimes when you're confronted with all of those data, you don't know what to do with them. So genetic counseling is important. I think there's another side of this, which is there are people, we're having sort of this conversation. I research AI in biotech, so I know tons about this area. We're living through times of deep, soul-crushing uncertainty, generally. And I could imagine somebody hearing what you're talking about and thinking, you're a big pharmaceutical company, these are permanent changes, I don't trust you. And I think we're living in a situation right now where people just don't understand a lot about science. They're not really being taught science, So what are we, what needs to be done so that people don't freak out? And again, we talked a little bit about this. Does anybody remember Dolly the sheep? Of course. So everybody, and if you don't know Dolly the sheep, this was a researcher was it Scotland?
It was in the UK, yeah.
Yeah. Working on some experiments for the purpose of advancing knowledge in medicine, not creating demonic sheep. But the world freaked out when when word got out. President Clinton had to have a special press conference. The Pope had a press conference. Everybody lost their minds. And a couple of years later, we don't have demonic sheep roaming the planet. We've got medicine. But it's a good example of how things can quickly go wrong when people don't understand what it is. So what's going to happen? Because at some point, the science is going to hit that inflection point. But if you don't bring people along with you, then in some ways, all of that work maybe isn't going to get to where it needs to be. So what do we do about that?
Yeah, I think it is a really good point. And today actually is one of the ways that we address that, right? We go out and we talk about the work that we're doing with different audiences of people and try and explain it, and then also be willing to sort of answer questions around why are we doing what we're doing.
So what's one of the what's a question that you get a lot? Just that, again, emblematic of where people are struggling, maybe understanding some of those.
For sure. So they see the otofolin-mediated hearing loss and they ask me okay, what about tinnitus? Or what about Meniere's disease? Or any of these other hearing loss diseases? When is the gene therapy coming for that? And then I have to sort of explain to them that not all diseases are created equal in terms of how amenable they are to a genetic medicine approach. And so while we might one day have a therapy for those, they're probably going to be in the longer term because they're more difficult than otoferlin, which is sort of a one gene problem.
But right, that's somebody like, I love those shoes. When do I get the blue color?
Yeah.
What I'm asking you is, what are you going to do when people at some point freak out about all of this? They shouldn't, but they're going to, because this is tough stuff to understand.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I sit on the bioethics committee that we have at Lilly, and so this is obviously one of the things that we talk about of any time you're making a permanent change. Like, it's a big deal. That's the reason why the things that you see today that people are applying this to, hemophilia, sickle cell, we're thinking about Alzheimer's. It's a universally fatal disease, right? We're not talking about trying to cure the common cold with genetic medicine today.
And there's some off-target maybe, or is that something that
I mean, that's always a worry. It's probably less of a worry in my mind than with sort of the traditional pills that we give people. Small molecules, every one is a unique unicorn that can do really positive things, but also challenging things. The genetic medicines, because they're sort of code-based, is more of a platform. So we have less of those unknowns. We still have some, but less comparatively.
And I would assume artificial intelligence helps you simulate in advance, so you're not just, right? Can you explain a little bit more about how AI plays a role here? Because I don't think people usually link artificial intelligence and biology, right?
No, we've been really lucky. Like I said, our medicine, genetic medicine, is a code-based system. And what AI is really good at is code like language, right? So you can think about ChatGPT understanding English. We have versions of things like ChatGPT for genetic code.
And it's an ACTG instead of a 1 and a 0.
Very simple.
So language. You're just saying we're like squishy robots that are full of code.
Essentially, yeah. Like, exactly.
I don't know how I feel about that. Do we have, there is a microphone somewhere, right? Do we have any questions from the audience? We do definitely have questions from the audience. So as you're grabbing your microphone, please first tell us who you are and then ask your question.
Hi, Andrew. Hi again, Amy. I'm Graham Scher from Canadian Blood Services. So my background's maybe not quite as interesting as yours, Andrew, but I began as a neuroscientist, became a hematologist oncologist, and now a large health system administrator, looking at bringing things like gene therapy for sickle cell and hemophilia to market for a large number of patients in Canada. So the science is fascinating, and I think Amy was taking you here in one of her most recent questions. But as a scientist, what are the ethical guardrails you're concerned about in terms of where the whole science of gene therapy can go and can potentially go awry?
Yeah, I think that's a really great question. And because, today what we're focused on at the company is treating established disease like otoferlin or sickle cell or hemophilia are great examples. I think the challenges and the guardrails you need to have is when you start thinking about enhancing function, that's not really something we're thinking about today and that we would probably have a lot of significant conversation around before we even started to debate that. I think, so if you stick to really severe diseases and treatments for really severe diseases, I think the ethics are less complicated in terms of one and done to help people. But when you get to, what if I could take hearing in your sister and not just make it normal, but make it better than normal or give people perfect pitch? Like, that's not really a medical problem, and we're a medicine company, so we're sort of focused around treating disease right now. So that for us is a guardrail, but could I see the industry moving outside those guardrails in future? Maybe. I mean, the therapies would have to be incredibly safe for us to think about doing that.
Thank you. Oh, thank you, Graham. Can I just, one quick note to that. So we've got guardrails. What about equity? Like, how do we make sure this feels very, expensive, or you have to be an ultra rare Pokemon to get access to some of this? Like, how do we make sure this isn't just a handful of people? You've got people in the global south. What are you thinking about that?
Yeah, I mean, obviously my goal as a scientist is that every Pokemon who's eligible gets the treatment.
Thank you, Andrew. Yeah. I have always wanted to have a conversation about Pokemon with one of the world's foremost scientists.
Sure.
All right, but the idea is, I mean, in some way, if you go far enough out, does this become more sensible than maybe just trying to create tons of therapies that require a cold chain? You've got to get from place to place. Is that kind of where your head's at?
Yeah, I mean, I think probably the way that I think about this is if you look at some of the obesity medicines, I think the more innovation in the space and the more investment in the space, what you see is like access provided to more people by reduced costs. Like we have a program at Lilly where people can buy vials of the medicine at a reduced price directly from us. Like we can hopefully in the future have that same impact in gene therapy. Because I have to admit, you know, when I look at multi-million-dollar prices, it doesn't feel great as a parent, right? Like if my kid needed one of those therapies. Our goal at Lilly, and I've talked about this with our executive committee and our board, is to provide access to these transformational therapies for as many people as possible. That's the idea behind the Resonate program, is just giving people more information so that they can seek treatment, you know, if they feel it's right for them. But obviously, you know, the flip side to that coin is these are incredibly expensive medicines to develop, and the business only exists if you can keep that cycle turning over. So there's a middle ground. Probably.
I think it's hard for people to understand, but you're absolutely right. All right, we have a long line. Who is next?
Hi, I'm Isabella from the Dubai Future Foundation. First of all, thanks a lot for making a potentially very complicated conversation understandable for everyone. Thanks for that. I have a question on epigenetic. I mean, I think it's becoming a common term as much as genetic medicine, also epigenetic. And I'm just very curious to know your opinion about it and how do you work hand in hand on this?
Yeah, we think about the epigenome a lot. And so for the rest of the audience, if you're not as familiar, what happens is, you know, as you live your life, your DNA has like little marks that attach themselves to it that modify how the genes work, how they're expressed or suppressed. And that is, you know, one of the reasons actually how we think aging works to a degree is that you accumulate some of these marks and they mean that things are not expressed properly. The cool thing about epigenetics is obviously with things like interacting with DNA, we have to be incredibly careful that we only do exactly what we want and we don't want to change the DNA in the wrong way. With the epigenetic marks, you're actually not interfering with the genome. You're interfering with, you know, an appendage onto the genome. So in theory, there's potentially an even greater level of safety with epigenetic modifications. I think the challenge is clinically so far, the evidence is limited in terms of the impact of the epigenome in terms of disease. But, you know, we have some collaborations, I think others in the field do, and there are quite a few biotechs focused on the epigenome. So I would expect the interest will continue to increase.
So that was a great question. And in Dubai, there's some work to try to have more genomes sequenced because we want to, you know, make this more available to everybody. So how much does because a lot of the research originally was just a handful of Caucasians, right? So so can you, in like 2 seconds, explain a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I think that that's a really good point. You know, equity in terms of sequence is really important to us. I think it actually is true of clinical trials as well. Ideally, the thesis being that you want information on the people who you're going to treat eventually.
That would be awesome.
Yeah, I mean,
yes, that's a good idea.
And so everybody, you know, uniformly is at risk. Well, that's not true. There are a few different things, but mostly everyone is at the risk of the same diseases, regardless of your ethnicity or country of origin or gender or anything else. And so what we need is that our clinical trials and our sequencing reflect that breadth of people so that we can check that the medicine works in all of those people.
Right, but that's partially where that epigenome question came from, because that also depends on location
100%.
where you are in the world, right?
Absolutely. I mean, and if you look at the field as a whole, the work that Decode Genetics did in Iceland, right? I think if you're in Iceland, your DNA is on file somewhere. And
I know what that is. Why don't you tell the good people what you're talking about?
there was an agreement made with the Icelandic government that the DNA sequences in an anonymized way would be aggregated for an entire country. And then people have used that to find new targets for things like neurodegenerative disease and for obesity. It's probably been less impactful than we thought. Like the human genome was kind of also a little bit less impactful
Yeah,
than we
but
thought.
it's a start.
Yeah,
It's
it gives you some clues.
Yeah, awesome. All right, next question.
Hi, Alex Javrankov. I run a company called In Silico Medicine focusing on AI. Huge fan. And Eli Lilly is probably the first and only company that made longevity part of its corporate strategy. And you have the GLP-1, GIP inhibitor, Mounjaro, which is likely the longevity therapeutic. So I'm actually wondering, what do you think about the impact of Mounjaro on the population health and on the longevity in the United States in general? Like, how many years do you think you're going to add? And also, how badly you're going to hurt pharma because many other diseases will be prevented?
Yeah, it's a great question. Thanks, Alex. So for the audience, Mounjaro is a medicine that we make for type 2 diabetes. Zepbound is the same medicine for obesity. It's the same class as Ozempic, and so it's the GLP-1 medicines that a lot of people have used successfully to lose weight and to treat their diabetes. What Alex is referring to, which is a really great point, is they also do broad things to improve metabolic health generally. So in the clinical trials, they reduce the number of cardiovascular events. They reduce all-cause mortality in some studies. So very, very interesting class of medicines that probably chip away at fundamental biology and that will lead, I would imagine, to absolutely improved health span. So because if you look at the list of things that kill human beings, it's like cardiovascular disease, dementia. The interesting thing about the GLP-1s that people don't talk about is, or not enough, they probably will when more of the trials come out, is that they actually really improve vascular health in your brain. So we see when you look at the retrospective data of this class of medicines, you look in the past at studies we've already done, there's a fairly significant reduction in dementia overall in people taking GLP-1s. And that probably has to do with increasing sort of blood flow in your brain and increasing the efficacy of the vascular system in your brain. So I would expect probably over the next few years, we'll start to understand more what that can mean in terms of size of effect. But everything we've seen so far looks really positive that we can potentially have an impact on health span with the GLPs.
I'm so happy that you asked that question because it highlights, I think, a core problem in science, which is we're always learning new things. Therefore, reality is always a little different, but I think people expect that one scientific discovery or that one thing to be that one thing forever. I mean, is that something that you also have to manage through?
Yeah. So we call it, like in my discovery groups, we try and find room for serendipity because a lot of the amazing things that we've made as an industry, the best medicines, many of them were sort of a happy accident while we were trying to do something else. So we're trying to make I think one of the famous examples is trying to make a blood pressure medicine, and we came up with Cialis, which had interesting side effects in the clinical trials, which elucidated what it actually did. And so those kinds of things are common, actually. We find when we run clinical trials, when we run experiments in human beings in the clinical setting, you can learn a lot preclinically in animal models and in cells, but it's really patients teach you the value of the things you make.
For sure. All right, we have a long line. Next question.
Hi, my name is Melissa Smith. I'm the CEO of Clario Biosciences, which is a new startup that develops novel genomic technologies for immunogenomics. So I'm curious, a lot of the diseases we've talked about today have this undercurrent of chronic inflammation. And so are you thinking about, and what do you think about genomic medicine strategies to target the inflammation that we think is doing a lot of the damage that could have more widespread effects across multiple disease spectra?
Yeah, it's a great question. And, from everything from cardiovascular disease to neurodegeneration, there's this, as you say, undercurrent of inflammation that seems to happen. And one of the things, actually, just to briefly flash back to the GLP-1s, is one of the things that they do is they reduce sort of global inflammation, and we think that's probably a good thing. GenMed for inflammation is an interesting idea. Probably more on the RNA end than the DNA end, because you probably want to preserve an inflammatory reaction in case you get, an infection or acute illness. So probably wouldn't go with a gene therapy or a gene edit there, but could go with an RNA-based medicine. So the difference between RNA and DNA is DNA, think about like one shot your entire life, you have that change. Most of the RNA things we make, you're talking sort of months to maybe a year in terms of how long they last, and then you go back to how you were before. So probably if I were going to do this, and we are looking at a number of things in the inflammation space with RNA, where you can have maybe, bring people back to homeostasis and then take them back off the medicine again.
Thanks so much.
Yep.
All right, logistics. We are nearing the end of the session, so here's what we're going to do. We're going to take one more question, but there are a lot of you with remaining questions, so we're going to do one. And then if you have additional questions, you've got access to this guy. I'm holding you hostage here. You're not allowed to leave until they ask. So you should stay and ask him questions. Does that sound good? Okay.
Absolutely.
So last question.
Thank you so much. This has been a great talk. I was wondering, as you talked about, you can buy a service to sequence your own genome. I've never done that, but I'm very curious about it. But I'm wondering what you think, as that becomes more popular from a bioethics standpoint, about people receiving information that may really alter how they see their own health span and lifespan, and how to kind of ameliorate that.
Yeah, I think that's such a really important question. So for me and for Amy, like, I think we get the information, and because we're in the space, you kind of understand most of what you're getting. I think for my mom, when she got the data back, you saw the picture, the first thing she did was text me, like, what does this mean? That's not an optimal situation for people to be in, right? Getting scary sounding words in an app is probably not the best way if you're not someone who's in the biotech space to receive that information. So I think, genetic counseling, maybe there is a role again here for sort of like AI-based technology to sort of simplify things in a conversational way.
Not yet, no.
No, you don't think?
I think a human is still good for right now, don't you?
The problem is actually, so genetic counseling is one of the most constrained resources in the US right now. It's not the testing per se, like, with the Resonate program, we'll provide the testing, but actually the most important thing that we provide is the counseling on the backside of that, so we can walk people through what the test means. Because that is, the challenge. When I was having a lunch with a friend who's on the board at Brigham Women's Hospital in Boston, their biggest constrained department at the hospital today is the genetic counseling department, because they get all of this testing coming in like en masse, but they have, not enough people to explain those tests to patients. So I think probably that's a supply and demand problem. As more of the data exists, maybe more genetic counselors get trained and come into the space, because we're going to need that for translation of some of these amazing therapies into medicines for patients.
Thank you.
Yeah.
All right, you just introduced people to a bunch of groundbreaking new discoveries, incredible pathways to the future. I'm sure, like me, everybody's like, it was only an hour. I want to learn more. So where is a trusted, reliable resource that people here can go look at later on if they're like, oh, genetic medicine, maybe this was the first time I heard about this, or the protein stuff? Is there and not a journal. It's like, where can normal people go to just, because like this is an area that's moving fast, so where do we go to stay on top of what's happening?
Yeah, we have what I think is a very accessible webpage at Lilly that talks about the genetic medicine work that we do, and that contains references to other places that people can go as well. And the goal there was to keep it accessible to the lay audience, so I would say probably start there. The challenge is a lot of the stuff that we're doing today is still experimental, and it's still in sort of the medical scientific field. It hasn't become mainstream yet, but probably start there, and I'll make sure that that's updated and has some links to some general resources as well.
All right. This was an amazing session. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, everybody, for your incredible attention and questions.